My Lord. And then he says, yeah, I've been through some tough times. I've had some hard times. I've had some folk to smile in my face and then stab me in the back. But you know what? Whatever. Forgetting those things which are behind. That's what he says in Philippians. And looking to those things which are before, I press toward the mark of the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. I'm not going to worry about you. You ought not worry about me. I'm not going to look back. The things behind me will depress me. I'm not going to look to the left nor to the right. The things around me will distract me. I will keep my eyes looking to him. Keep my eyes focused on the goal. Keep my eyes while I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. I'm trying to tell you what to focus on and what to ignore. And then the brother turns around finally in chapter 4 and he says, finally, in case you didn't get it in chapter 1 and in chapter 2 and in chapter 3, he says, finally, beloved, whatever. You know what? You ought to go tomorrow and instead of worrying about somebody who's been giving you a hard time, instead of trying to fight somebody who's been taking you around and moving you through the ringer, you pulling out your hair, worrying about this thing and worrying about that thing. I dare you to look your situation in the eye. I dare you to look your enemy in the eye. I dare you to look that person who would cuss you out in the eye. And don't be mean to them because you are a child of God. Matter of fact, you ought to say it just like Paul said it. You ought to be real nice and sweet. You look at the verse. He says, finally, beloved, whatever. You need a whatever theology if you're going to make it through the madness and the mess that is our world. You need to learn to focus on this and not on that. There's some things that you need to focus on. He says, whatever is noble, whatever is just, you ought to focus on justice. You ought to be an instrument of justice in the world. He says, whatever is true, you ought to be a defender of what is true, and you ought to despise lies and gossip. He said, whatever is of good report, you ought to rejoice in that. He said, if there is anything excellent, you ought to focus on excellence in a mediocre world. You ought to focus on this and ignore that. If there's any of these things, focus on these things. He says, think. Think about these things. In a world that doesn't like to think, I want you to be very clear. This is a sermon not encouraging you not to think. This is a sermon that encourages you to think and to think about what you ought to think about. You ought to be reflective. You ought not be unreflective and unconcerned and uncritical. There's some hard facts in the world that we've all got to face.